Hey everybody, Pat Fenner from Breakthrough Homeschooling, and welcome to this episode of the You Can Homeschool podcast, where I have the privilege of interviewing homeschool dad and et al. And other things, Dr. Douglas Pietersma. And I actually came across them where we met each other via LinkedIn, which if you're a homeschooler and you're not there, you might want to check that out because there's some good resources on there for homeschooling and a lot of information and kind of professional development kind of stuff there. And Dr. Petersma is definitely contributing to that conversation there. So he's an education researcher holding a Doctor of Education degree from Regents University and has done a lot of research on homeschooling and Christian education. He's a speaker, an author, and where I actually saw him first was his video series called 10-Minute Home Education Seminars. So those are on LinkedIn. Again, I'll have a link to one of them in the show notes. Definitely want to check them out. They're interesting. And so that's all I'm going to say by virtue of introduction. Would you go ahead and fill that in and just give us a little bit background on yourself and your family and how you got involved in homeschooling?
Certainly. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate this. Homeschooling really has become my life in a number of different ways, but it hasn't always been this way. Started off much like you would think of, and I don't know if I should use the word traditional, but at least a more average homeschooling family where my wife was providing all of the academic instruction to my children. I was full-time in the military. And we started that basically because it was convenient for us. I was going to be moving every couple of years. We knew that it would be very useful for us to have that continuity in education. So that's what we started with. And then as I came to the end of my military career, wanted to take a little bit of the load off my wife's plate. So I took one of our two children's studies under my belt. She kept the other one for a couple of years. And then eventually I have now both of them as she took on a second career or a new career, I guess you could call it. And it was, just something that just started to develop and snowball, and things that I wanted to do for my children, I wanted to share with other people. And that became a business, providing co-curricular courses to other homeschooling families. And then, of course, I decided to make use of my veterans education benefits and went back to school. And that's how I ended up completing the doctorate at Regent University. And so pretty much now everything I do in life is in one way or another wrapped up into homeschooling. So it's been a great journey, and I look to keep going down this path.
That's great. Well, we certainly do appreciate having that male contribution to the homeschool, because we know, that it's a lot of women, and for understandably for obvious reasons, but it's always nice to have homeschool dads involved too as well. Tell us a little bit about Altameta Homeschool Auxiliary. That's an interesting name.
It is. I got the name because in the military, I was a Spanish linguist. So Spanish language is something that I've been involved in for 20 plus years of my life. And I wanted a business name that kind of captured the essence of what all the different aspects of my business are about. And Altameta is a compound of two Spanish words, one alta meaning high and meta meaning goals. So high goals, or I want to encourage people to reach the highest goals they can in whatever area. And so we have the Homeschool Auxiliary, which provides courses, mostly foreign language, but I also do some high school life preparation courses. So speech, debate, financial management, and composition. And then we also have a martial arts school, which is, funnels into the homeschool community via their PE program. And so everything we do, whether it's the auxiliary, whether it's the martial arts school, the research that I do, really, I want it to encourage people to reach their highest goals, their highest potential, whether that be my children or other people's children. So that's kind of the genesis of the name. And pretty much everything that has come out of the business has simply been an extension of what we've already been doing. I wanted to teach my kids something. I want to invite other people to participate in that, and it becomes a class. So that's kind of how all that came about.
That's awesome. So are most of your classes online, or I know you're out of, I think, Cheyenne, Wyoming?
Correct. So I started off and I wasn't doing any online teaching to begin with. All of mine were in-person classes, but I have actually transitioned some online before the whole COVID situation. I took a course online as a test bed to make sure I had all my ducks in a row from a technology perspective. And I was using students who were local to me anyway, but I was just doing it online to make sure it would work. And right in the middle of that school year is when everything shut down, all my courses went online. So right now, everything that I do teach is online. except the PE, which is our Kempo class, martial arts class that we have. And it had a side benefit. The side benefit is now I can have students from outside our local area being involved. And with the language classes, that becomes very, very helpful because the students have a greater variety of other students to interact with when they're doing their language training. So it turned out to be a side benefit. And so now all of the courses are online with the exception of PE.
That's awesome. Yeah, PE would be a little tough to do online, although I guess some people would try it. I don't know. Our kids were involved.
There are some who have done that, and I actually know some martial arts schools that, at least during the COVID situation, they took all of their classes online. They made the best that they could during that particular time. So
that's fascinating. My kids took karate for a number of years, and I can't imagine that online, but that's okay. You are a very active poster on LinkedIn, as I mentioned a little bit in the introduction. And you have a lot of really wonderful education related articles and links and stuff. How would you describe your why? Like why do you write so much about homeschooling? You know, what's your why with all that you're doing?
Well, I love that question. It's actually one of the fascinating aspects of homeschooling, and it really kind of transcends homeschooling into the rest of life. The why of anything we do is probably the most fundamental and important thing that we need to ascertain before we, rush headlong into whatever it is that we're doing. And I don't think a lot of times we do that. I'll be honest with you. When we started homeschooling, we didn't sit down and think about the why. It was convenient. It worked. My wife was an elementary school teacher before I met and married her. It was like, hey, this works and we're going to do it.
Right.
There was a man I met a number of years ago while I was still on active duty. His name is Simon Sinek. He's an author and a public speaker. And he wrote a book called Start With Why. And the book is not about homeschooling. It's not even about education. It's more written for the corporate or government kind of world. But everything in there really applies, no matter what you're doing. It can be your hobbies, your church life, your school, whatever. Sitting down to figure out your why. And sometimes it's a lot harder than you think. You sit down to think about why I do something and you come up with a list of things that you do, but not necessarily the foundational why, because our brains really aren't wired to do that. So, I had that kind of revelation years before we started homeschooling, and now I have applied that to homeschooling. And in homeschooling, why is so important? Because every family is so unique. Their why is going to change based on their family circumstances, the situations. Big families, little families, rural families, urban families, all of those are going to have different whys, and they shouldn't be the same. You've got different family configurations, single parent homes, homes where both parents are working full time and still trying to, make this happen. And so all of those variations, plus the variations of us as individuals, mean that the why can have so many different, every family can have their own unique why. But it's very important to have one. So my personal why has more to do with my faith. And I would say that once I sort of boiled everything down to the baseline, what is my why? It's faith-based. I want my children to follow our family's faith tradition. I want them to be disciples of Christ. I want them to be ambassadors for his kingdom. And everything we do, homeschooling, not homeschooling, even outside of the house stuff, vacations and hobbies, I want all of that to feed into it. And I want all that to support that great foundation. Other families aren't going to have that same foundation necessarily, and that's perfectly fine. It's exactly the way it should be. Right. Some families come up with a why and they put it on the wall, call it a mission statement or a vision statement. They may have gotten that from the corporate world. Corporate world picked up on that in the mid-90s, and everywhere had to have a mission statement and a vision statement. That's fine. That's great. It's great to have that, front and center. This is why we're doing it. I personally don't have one on the wall, but people ask me that question a number of times, and my standard answer is, I want my children to be disciples of Christ. I want them to be ambassadors for his kingdom. And everything that we do really builds upon that, and it comes up from there. So over time, your why may change. My why has, again, from the beginning of our homeschooling journey till now, it's not been exactly the same. And I don't expect that it would be for any particular family. But, we've come to a place now where it's pretty solid. It's pretty stable. That really hasn't changed in a number of years. And now that my children are one in high school and one in middle school, headed towards high school, that's pretty much how it's probably going to stay for the rest of our time, at least for the homeschooling purposes. But it's very important. It's very important for every family to sit down and do this and figure out that why, for, mothers and fathers to be involved in it, and even to let the children know. My kids hopefully know this is why I'm doing this. I want to communicate that to them. So when there's a change that we have to make, why? It's because we want to focus it towards our intended purpose. And I want, I want them to be able to know that. So that's a very important thing. And mine, like I say, is faith-based. I run into a lot of homeschoolers with a myriad of different reasons and a myriad of different whys. And I think that's awesome. I think that's exactly one of the things that makes homeschooling great is, when other parts of the world are crying diversity, this is what the homeschooling has. It's a huge diversity in the homeschooling community and getting more diverse, especially by the statistics that we've seen lately. So it's an awesome thing. And so that's what I put out there as my why.
Well, speaking of diversity too, and how recently events are changing that, or building on that, how would you say the pandemic that we're just getting ourselves out of, how has that affected the homeschool community? I know a lot of people say they're homeschooling, and it really is just I call it distance learning, because they're using public school materials and everything, just sitting their kids in front of a Zoom meeting.
That's right.
So
it's interesting. From what I've seen, there is, first of all, the situation, COVID situation, has affected education, homeschooling education, traditional school education. It's affected all of it, everything. Harvard just had a series of conferences that they called the post-pandemic future of homeschooling conferences. And one of the things that came out of 2 or 3 of their sessions was this big thing. We can't even really define what is the rock solid homeschooling. So for those of us in the homeschooling world, when we hear people that, hey, my kids are in public school, but they're doing their work from home, we're homeschooling, and most of us go, I don't think that's homeschooling. And they're welcome to call it that, but obviously that's not my definition of it. So I expect that we're going to see some research papers and some scholarly works over the next couple of years trying to sort of nail down that definition. I obviously find that homeschooling, or I believe that homeschooling, is that parent-directed, privately funded, from home with family, that kind of an education. But it has changed. The pandemic has changed so many things, including homeschooling. I actually wrote a recent article. It was published in the Old Schoolhouse magazine. Yeah, and I published that, and it was about COVID and the increase of homeschooling and so forth. And one of the things I said in there is the landscape of education has changed forever. And it really has. We're not going to have an education conversation, whether homeschooling or any other kind of an education conversation. We're not going to have a conversation in the next 10 to 15 years that doesn't come back to, what did we learn? What are the things that we drew away from the COVID situation? How did that make things change? And so it changed in a lot of different ways. Primarily, I think it changed parents and how they perceive education and how they looked at their children's education. So those that may have had their children in a school who came home and now they could, watch them do their school as they did it online. Again, what I would call, crisis homeschooling or just simply distance homeschooling. Many parents realize, hey, there's things here that their kids are being taught that I didn't really know about. There's surprises about how much time they needed to spend actually studying. And they're like, hey, my kids get done with school in like 3 hours, or if they just add up all the time, what do we do with the rest of the time? Well, we've got all this family time. I think parents found joy in spending time with their kids. Imagine that you would have joy in time spending with your own children. And of course, I do, because we do that all the time. And again, many parents saw things in the school system that they didn't like when it came to schools reopening and, school board meetings and teachers unions making arguments that had nothing to do with education. And the parents are going, why is this a factor, as it relates to my children's education? And many times the answer is it's not a factor. It's, it's what it was with the politics of particular teachers unions and so forth. I actually read a book recently written by, name just escapes me. Her last name is Friedrichs, but it was about taking on Goliath. And it was about that interaction between teachers who really want to do something for kids and the fact that they can't in many cases because of the oppression by teachers unions. Anyway, all of those things combined have driven a surge in homeschooling. How long it lasts, how far it goes, we don't really know yet. The Census Bureau estimated in a survey that homeschooling tripled, and that was just 2 surveys done inside the year 2020. So they did one early 2020, one end of 2020. It tripled in that time frame, and they were only counting families. So if you average in more than one child per household, which is definitely, the average is definitely more than one, the number of actual homeschoolers may have gone up by more than triple. Again, we're not going to know the clarity of that kind of data for a while. There still needs to be a lot of research done, and that's fine. It gives us, a goal of things to look at, but it has definitely changed the landscape. The types of education have changed. I've heard people talk about not just homeschooling versus public schooling. I've heard about hybrid schooling. I've heard about, cooperatives between schools and homeschool families, whether they call them, I call mine a homeschool auxiliary. Other people call them enrichment programs at a school. And there's just so many variations. I read a book on unschooling, something that I didn't even really think about that long ago. It was written by an author named Carrie McDonald. And just so many different ways. And if you even ask a veteran educator, is this statement true? All children learn differently. They're going to say yes, because they've lived it, right? Every child's got that difference. So to find the uniqueness that is tailored directly to that child is nigh impossible in a schooling environment.
Absolutely.
You've got a curriculum, you've got a schedule. At best you can reach the average. Well, who's average? Well, you take a class of, 30 students and maybe 2 of them are close to that average, maybe, right? If you're lucky, 2 or 3, but everybody else is either going to be a little bit ahead and bored or a little bit behind and lost. And, pragmatically, and it's not about the dedication of teachers. Teachers can be 100% dedicated, but they can't get to know a class of 30 students in a span of 9 months, tailor that education to all 30 of them. Whereas in a family, you start getting to know your kids from day one, from birth. You're already 10 steps ahead, even if you don't have education credentials and, pieces of paper on the wall or anything like that. So, things have changed. I think things have changed for the better. I think there's more change to come as it relates to public schools. The parents that realized, hey, something's wrong here, this needs to get fixed. And maybe they're not ready to jump into homeschooling, but they're ready to get involved in that schooling effort. They're ready to go to those school board meetings and make their voices be heard. And so I think that's a good thing. And for a lot of those institutions to change, it's going to take something very, very detrimental. And for most of them, that's money. So if enough people pull out of those programs, they lose money. Now you've got what we call capitalism at work, because up to this point, you've really had a monopoly. I mean, for 100 years-ish, the public school system has the monopoly. Now we have freedom to homeschool, but most people are still, using the public schools. They have that monopoly in that role. But if you throw competition in there, it's going to force them to change. They're going to have to do that or they end up losing money. So I think that's kind of how it changed. I don't know if I went off track from your answer or not, but I tend to do that, kind of ramble and go on for a while.
I think it's all connected. Absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of sad. You're talking about how you can have some wonderful teachers, and we have friends, our family has many friends who are teachers in both public and Christian school arenas. And they really look at their jobs as a mission, like it's a mission field for them. Do a lot of extra work, not much pay and everything like that. And it's, it's heartening to know that there are people like that in the system. But I think just by virtue of being in the system, you're right, you can't meet. It doesn't matter how well the kids in your classroom. You can't tailor to a class of 30. I mean, it's out of reach.
Yeah, there was a book written by a man named Jay Jacino called Truth is Fallen in the Streets. And he deals specifically with that, with, what do, Christian believers, people of strong, conservative values, what do they do? What can they do? And oftentimes the answer is they can't do anything, depending on the school system. Not all of them are the same. But there's a lot of fights that they have to do, a lot of fights that they have to go through. Rebecca Friedrichs, she's the one that wrote the book on Facing Down Goliath, I think it was called.
Okay,
and same thing.
And I'll put links to these books he's talking about because they sound fascinating in the show notes. So make sure you look them up. Okay. You are a very hands-on homeschool dad, obviously. And we understand from how your transition went from that. But what advice or suggestions would you give to a dad who wants to be more engaged, but is really struggling with being the sole breadwinner? I mean, there's a lot of dads who are in that situation. And certainly with COVID, that's kind of become a little more fluid because everybody's spending all their time together. But what words of wisdom would you have to share with them?
Well, I'll tell you this. This is actually a topic that's very close to my heart, not just because I'm a dad that does the homeschooling or that I'm a dad in a homeschooling family, but it's really something that I think can impact homeschooling families for the better so much. So I wrote an article. It's one of the LinkedIn articles you talked about last December called Fathers in Homeschooling. And I followed that up just recently. I think it published yesterday, was one of the 10-minute home education seminars that you talked about on that exact same topic. And you can find those seminars on YouTube as well. And so my passion with those pieces, that video and that article, are to encourage homeschooling fathers. And when I say homeschooling fathers, I kind of boil it down into two types. One is going to cover almost everybody. I don't know what the percent would be, but it would be high into the 90s, if not high end of the 90s. And that are fathers who are working, whether from home or somewhere else. The mother is typically providing the educational guidance and teaching and instruction. There's a lot of things that they can do. I know that I'm in a little bit different situation. So I'm actually providing the main educational instruction to my children. My wife also works, but she works from home. So we are still all together, much like many in the COVID situation, and just the sort of shakeup between work and school and life and all that. So I understand where most husbands are at, and I can also relate because I was there. So in the earlier part of our children's homeschooling, I was that full-time worker, military, deployed from time to time, and that kind of thing. So hopefully this comes across not as just, I've been there, I've done that, but also I'm talking with people constantly. And so I have a number of recommendations that I think will help. And these will apply in a lot of situations. If you have a variation like a single parent home or something like that, there's things here that can apply. So hopefully I haven't, left anybody out or isolated anybody from this discussion. But the first thing I would say is this, and this comes from my personal perspective. And that is, if you're a family of faith, the first and most important thing the father can and should do is teach the children the family's faith tradition. If you feel like you don't know how to do that, this is where your faith community comes into play. They can help. They can provide material, information, guidance, mentors, whatever it happens to be. So as you learn, you're teaching your children. And I think that is such a critical thing. As we look at it from a faith perspective, I do a lot of my research that relates to Christian worldview or discipleship. And one of the number one things that researchers have found as an indicator that children will carry on a family's faith tradition is the fact that the father is actively involved in the faith tradition and in teaching them the faith tradition. That is such a huge thing. So I encourage fathers to do that. Your children, I say this, should be your first and highest priority disciples. So if you're going to pass on your faith tradition to anybody, it should first and foremost come from you to your children. The second thing I like to suggest to fathers is teach your children something that you know. If you have a skill or a trade, if it's fixing cars or foreign language, it can be anything. Teach your children that. They may or may not follow in your footsteps. You may be a mechanic. You teach them how to be a mechanic. They may go off to be a journalist. Fine. The thing about teaching them, you're going to gain so much out of this. They're going to gain so much out of this, even if they go off to do something completely different. Right. I can say this with a fair amount of certainty. I don't know of any dad who's going to say later on when his kids are grown, I wish I'd spent less time with my kids. Yeah. I don't know any kids who are going to grow up and become adults and say, I wish my dad had spent less time with me. George Barna is a researcher, and he says that on average, children spend 23 hours per week with their father. And that's with like a full-time working father. I say this, make those hours count. If you've got 23 hours, make those hours count. And you're going to get some other benefits, okay? You, whoever they are, me, we're going to learn so much about our children when we do that. If we have an occupation that allows us to draw our children in to observe or participate, or when they're old enough to actually start working in our occupation, that's another opportunity for them to learn from us, for them to see real life application for all of these things they're learning. I went to a homeschool convention early on in this year here in Wyoming, and we had Todd Wilson in. They call him the family man. He was the main speaker. And one of the things that he said was, every moment of every day, school is in session. Something's going on, you have an opportunity to learn, that's your lesson for the moment. So kind of the theme of going after that was he would tell an anecdotal story, and then the answer would be, well, school's in session because you're learning something. And as a parent, you're teaching something. And it doesn't have to be formal book learning and so on and so forth. Of course, we know we want our kids to do that. But fathers involved in that way are going to get to know their kids. They're going to get to know their learning styles. They're going to get to know their strengths, their weaknesses, all the things that they need to know not only to be better teachers to them, but also to help their wives, which brings me to another suggestion, which is fathers being involved in as many of the aspects of homeschooling as possible. So if the mother is the primary teacher and she's doing curriculum planning, if the father has taught the kids something, anything, he now has a window into their life as a student, into their learning styles, so he can be a benefit to her in suggesting, hey, student John learns this way, and this will be good for him, and he can provide that kind of support as she maybe makes the bulk of those decisions, but he can provide that input. If you're designing the place for the children to do the school, whether it's a schoolroom or a corner of the kitchen or part of their room or whatever it happens to be, dad building something that the kids are going to use in school is something the kids are going to remember. Hey, dad did that for me. That is part of his participation that he can certainly do. So he can get involved in that. He can get involved in anything from waking him up in the morning and getting him ready, unless he's already at work, in which case, hopefully he comes home early enough that he can help them with homework or anything extracurricular. So you got to find those opportunities. And, for most fathers, this is going to take a sacrifice. This is going to be, hey, you know what? I got to take my hobby that I like to do a lot, and I'm going to have to put that aside for right now because I want to invest that in my children. And as much as it may pain us to do something like that, it's never going to be a regret. It's never going to be something that we come back and say, I wish I'd have played more golf instead of being with my kids. I'm not going to do that. That's right. But if you can find something to do, teach your children. If you can take one of the educational requirements off your wife's plate and teach that, that's an even bigger bonus. So let's say you're just good at math or you're just good at whatever, and you decide, hey, I want to take that part of my kids' education. It may be one subject out of 5 or 1 out of 6 or whatever it happens to be. That has so many benefits. You're learning how your kids learn. You're teaching them something You're helping your wife by taking something off her plate. And it doesn't matter if you have to do this on evenings or weekends or some sort of a weird alternative schedule because of your work, and you have to do it every 3rd day throughout the course of a school year. It doesn't really matter. The fact that a husband and a father can take that one piece has so many benefits. It helps the wife, it helps the kids, it encourages them, it shows that you're interested in their learning. And I think we want to be interested in their learning. So I think that is some of the critical things that they can do. If you're involved in a homeschool co-op, dads can be part of parent planning, volunteer teaching if they have the time. What are the financial requirements of the organization? Get involved in any way you can if your family's involved in that. Even if you're not there during a co-op day, you can still have an impact in that. And so I think there's a number of ways. I'm certain I haven't listed even a 10th of them. There's many other ways. And I think if we take the time to look as fathers, we'll find opportunities that we weren't even looking for. So that's kind of my recommendations to dad. There's so much to be involved in, and your involvement is very, very important in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would add too that another benefit for fathers too is just the personal growth. I know not only as a parent, but as a homeschool mom, I have learned, I'm not even talking about subjects, I've learned so much about myself and how I relate to my kids, how I relate to others, how I relate to God through homeschooling and I just think that there's so many opportunities for us, even as adults and parents, and to learn. So that's wow, that's really encouraging. Thank you. That was great. So
absolutely
great. So what do you have anything coming up in the future? I know you're a speaker as well. Have you transitioned or pivoted to the online speaking gigs these days?
Well, other than doing the 10-minute home education seminars, I don't have any scheduled speaking events. I'm preparing those. I actually was entering the speakers world last year when all of the conventions shut down. And so I've done a small amount of speaking at our local convention here in Wyoming. I've visited and attended conventions in other areas. So that's really kind of getting off the ground. I'm trying to put a book together right now. It's not published yet, but when that does, I'll let folks know about that. And mostly you can read what's going to be in that book, because it's all the essays that I've already written and they're posted on LinkedIn. And what that book is going to be is all of those essays compiled.
That's awesome.
And so other than that, I'm working with some different organizations and potentially doing some research, but I don't have anything solidified right now. I'm just excited. This is a time in homeschooling where it's exciting because it's gone from what is homeschooling to, okay, yeah, we get what homeschooling is. Now let's learn more about it. And in the
Right.
education world, homeschooling is fairly well under-researched, but that won't be the case for long, especially after the pandemic.
Yeah, you're going to see to that, right? Because you'll be doing a lot of the research.
I'm gonna do my best.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you again for being with us today. And let me encourage you, those of you who are listening to this, there is a wealth of information you could learn from Doug. I will put links below, as I said, in the show notes. I'll also link to your YouTube channel so you can see the other 10-minute homeschool seminars, which are really, really, really well done. And yeah, so if you have any questions too for Doug, you can email them to us, help@breakthroughhomeschooling.com, or you can use the SpeakPipe link that we have also in the show notes, and we will ask the resident expert here, researcher, for his opinion. So thank you again. And let me remind you all, we'll see you next week, of course, but remember that you can homeschool and it can be a fabulous thing. So take care, y'all. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Pat.